I noticed something was wrong the moment she stopped asking questions. That was the thing about my son's girlfriend in the beginning. Serena asked about everything: the house, the garden, the view from the back porch over the lake. She wanted to know which rooms got morning light, whether the basement had been finished, how old the furnace was. I thought she was just the type who paid attention to details. My son Daniel had always been drawn to curious, intelligent women, and at first, that curiosity felt like a compliment. She was interested in our life, in what we'd built. It was only later, sitting alone at my kitchen table in Brockville with a cup of tea gone cold beside me, that I understood the difference between curiosity and reconnaissance. My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old. I spent 26 years teaching high school English in a small town outside Kingston, Ontario, and when I retired, I sold the house I'd shared with my late husband Robert and moved into the home he'd inherited from his parents, a century home on a half-acre lot near the street. Lawrence, with a wraparound porch, original hardwood floors, and a property assessment that had surprised even me when I'd finally looked it up 2 years ago. Robert passed from a sudden cardiac event 4 years before any of this happened. He was 58. He was healthy, as far as we knew. And then one Tuesday morning in November, he was gone. Grief does something particular to a person who has been in a partnership for 3 decades. It doesn't just take the person, it takes the version of yourself that only existed in relation to them. I spent the first year barely functional. The second year, I started to come back to myself. By the third year, I had rebuilt something that felt like a life smaller than before, quieter, but genuinely mine. I had my pension, Robert's life insurance, a modest RRSP that had grown steadily, and the house. Always the house. It was the one thing I could put my hands on that still felt like both of us. Daniel is 34. He works in project management for a construction firm in Ottawa, about 2 hours from Brockville. He visited most Sundays when work allowed, and we had a rhythm. He'd arrive around noon, I'd make lunch, we'd walk along the water if the weather was reasonable, and he'd head back before dark. We were close in the way that people who have both lost the same person often become close, bound by the shape of what's missing. He met Serena at a colleague's dinner party in the fall. He mentioned her casually at first, just that he'd met someone, that she seemed interesting, that she worked in financial planning downtown. I didn't press. Daniel had dated seriously twice before, and both times had ended without drama and without my involvement, which I considered a healthy sign. I trusted his judgment. I had no reason not to. She came to Brockville for the first time in January, about 3 months after they'd started seeing each other. Daniel had warned me she was sharp and a little reserved, and I'd prepared myself for a quiet afternoon. But Serena walked into my house and immediately became warm, in a way that felt almost practiced, complimenting the crown molding, asking about the photographs on the mantel, laughing at something I said about the cold with exactly the right amount of ease. She was 31, dark-haired, well-dressed in that understated way that suggests money or very good taste. She held eye contact a beat longer than most people do. The question about the property came before dessert. We were still at the table, and Daniel had gone to the kitchen to get more coffee, when Serena leaned back slightly and said, "This is such a beautiful home, Margaret. Has it been in your family long?" I explained that it had been Robert's parents' house, that we'd moved in after his mother passed, that we'd done significant renovations but kept the bones. She nodded. "Then, do you own the whole lot, or is part of it shared with the neighbors?" I told her the half-acre was ours entirely. She nodded again, in a way that felt like someone checking a box. I told myself it was small talk. The second visit was in March. Daniel brought her for a weekend, and on Saturday afternoon, while he was on a work call upstairs, Serena sat across from me in the living room and steered the conversation toward finances in a way that was smooth enough that I almost didn't notice the steering. She mentioned the property values along the street Lawrence, how much they'd risen since 2020. She mentioned that a colleague of hers had recently helped a client restructure assets ahead of retirement. She asked whether I'd ever considered downsizing, and when I said I hadn't, she said, "Of course, no pressure. I just think about these things professionally, and sometimes it's hard to turn it off." She smiled. I smiled. Daniel came downstairs and the conversation shifted. That night I lay awake and tried to decide what I had actually heard. The answer I kept arriving at was nothing I could name. Everything she'd said was reasonable. She worked in financial planning. Of course, she thought about property and assets. I was being unfair, projecting something onto a woman who had done nothing wrong. I put it out of my mind. The third visit changed things. It was May, a long weekend, and Daniel had mentioned that Serena was thinking of making the drive alone one afternoon to drop off a housewarming gift for a friend in Gananoque, just 30 minutes from Brockville, and would stop in to say hello if I didn't mind. I said of course. She arrived around 2 o'clock with a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Riesling and a warmth that I was beginning to recognize as something she turned on and off. We sat on the back porch. She admired the water view, and then she said casually, the way you might comment on the weather, "Has Daniel talked to you at all about the future?" His future, I mean. Where you both see things going? I set my glass down. In what sense? She smiled that slightly too wide smile. Oh, just generally. He mentioned once that this house would eventually, I don't know, that there'd been some conversation about what happens down the road. I probably misunderstood. She waved a hand. Ignore me. I've been in too many estate planning meetings this week. Daniel had not mentioned any such conversation to me. We had not discussed what would happen to the house down the road. That conversation didn't exist. I told her I wasn't sure what he'd said, but that I had no current plans for the property. She nodded pleasantly and refilled my glass, and we talked about the long weekend and her family in Sudbury, and by the time she left, I had smiled and waved from the porch as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. I just didn't have the language for it yet. I called my closest friend Patricia that evening. Patricia is 67, recently retired from family law in Kingston, and has the particular quality of being exactly honest, even when honesty is inconvenient. I told her the 3 conversations in order, without editorializing. When I finished, there was a pause. "She's mapping your estate," Patricia said. "That's a very dramatic way to put it." It's the accurate way to put it. She knows what the house is worth. She's establishing what Daniel's inheritance looks like, and whether it flows to him clearly, or whether there are complications. This is what people in financial planning do when they're working a personal angle. Margaret, I've seen this in court. Not always, but I've seen it. I thanked her and hung up and sat with it for a long time. The thing about being in your 60s and having built something carefully over many years is that you develop a particular sensitivity to people who want to hold what you've built without having built it. It is not bitterness. It is pattern recognition earned at considerable cost. And once Patricia had named the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. I did not confront Daniel, not yet. He was happy in a way I hadn't seen since before. His father died lighter, more present, calling more often. Whatever Serena was doing with me in private, she appeared to be genuinely good for my son in his daily life, and I wasn't willing to dismantle that on a feeling. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with. I started paying closer attention. In June, Daniel mentioned that Serena had suggested they look at buying a condo together in Ottawa. Nothing serious, just early conversations. He mentioned it the way you mention a possibility lightly, without weight, but I noticed that when he described the conversations they'd had about finances, he referenced several times that Serena had raised the question of what long-term family assets might look like. My son is a thoughtful man, but not a financially detailed one. He would not have used that phrase on his own. In July, I was sorting through some papers and came across the deed to the house, and on an impulse I cannot entirely explain, I made a copy and asked Patricia to hold it in her files, along with the copy of Robert's will, which left everything to me, which was not complicated, which was, legally, entirely clear. Patricia did not ask why. She simply said, "Good thinking," and filed them. In August, Daniel called on a Tuesday, not a Sunday, which was unusual, and said that he and Serena had gotten engaged. He sounded genuinely joyful, and my heart did the thing hearts do when the person you love most is happy, which is to expand in spite of everything else. I told him I was thrilled. I told him I loved him. I told him I wanted to celebrate together soon. After we hung up, I sat very still in my kitchen for a while. Then I called Patricia again. "He's engaged." "I know. I saw it coming. What do you need?" "I need to understand what she can legally access, Patricia. If they marry. If something happens to me, walk me through it." Patricia was thorough and patient. In Ontario, she explained, a spouse does not automatically inherit from a parent-in-law. A daughter-in-law has no claim on my estate. My home was mine, named clearly in Robert's will as it transferred to me, and my own will, which I had updated 2 years prior, left everything to Daniel outright. The risk, if there was one, was not legal entitlement but influence. If Daniel inherited and was married, Serena would have access to whatever he had, which meant the concern wasn't what she could take from me, it was what she might direct him toward once I was gone. Or before you're gone, Patricia said quietly. If she can establish some kind of financial dependence on your part, get herself named as any kind of support or power of attorney, that's a different picture. I had not given anyone power of attorney, but I had not formally assigned it either. The gap made me uncomfortable in a new way. The engagement party was held in Ottawa in September at a restaurant Serena had chosen elegant, expensive, with a guest list that skewed toward her friends and colleagues and Daniel's work contacts. I drove up and wore a dress I'd bought in Kingston and brought a card with a heartfelt note and a check for a reasonable amount. I smiled through 100 photographs. I liked some of Serena's friends. I could see, watching her move through the room, that she was skilled socially in the way that certain people are skilled. It was not false exactly, just precise. She knew who to charm and when. At one point in the evening, Serena pulled me aside near the bar and said something that I have thought about every day since. She said, "Margaret, I want you to know that I understand what this house means to Daniel. It's not just property, it's memory. I hope you know I would always protect that." It was a beautiful thing to say. It was also the thing you would say if you had been thinking about the house enough to have prepared a speech about the house. "I know you would," I said, and smiled, and kept everything I was thinking entirely behind my eyes. I drove home to Brockville that night and began the process of becoming quietly, carefully prepared. I updated my will with a lawyer in Kingston, not Patricia, someone else, someone with no connection to anyone, to add a clause that the house could not be sold for 5 years following my death without the agreement of a secondary trustee, which I named as my sister-in-law Joyce, who lives in Thunder Bay and is the most stubborn woman I have ever met. I formally assigned power of attorney to Patricia. I moved the original deed and several other key documents to a lockbox at the Bank of Montreal, rather than keeping them at the house. None of these things were dramatic. None of them required confronting anyone. I simply made it so that the architecture of my estate was no longer something that could be redirected easily. October was quiet. Daniel and Serena visited twice. Serena was warm and funny and attentive, and there were moments where I genuinely liked her and then felt strange about genuinely liking her. I wondered sometimes if Patricia and I had constructed a threat that wasn't entirely real. People work in financial planning and think about assets. People ask about property. People say charming things at engagement parties. Perhaps Serena was simply a woman who moved through the world with pragmatic awareness, and I had weaponized that awareness in my grief-widowed, overcautious mind. Then November came, and I found the email. I want to be careful about how I describe this because the circumstances were ordinary, and I was not snooping. I was visiting Daniel in Ottawa for a long weekend, and I was using his laptop to look up a recipe because my phone battery had died, and I accidentally clicked into his open email browser, and the first message in his inbox was from a name I didn't recognize, but the subject line read, Transfer of Property Preliminary Discussion. I did not read the email. I closed it. I sat back from the laptop. My hands were very steady, which told me something about how far past panic I had already traveled. That evening after dinner, when Serena had gone to meet a friend and Daniel and I were washing up, I said as casually as I could manage, "Have you spoken with anyone recently about the Brockville house? A lawyer or financial planner?" Daniel's response was a half-second too slow. "What do you mean? Have there been any conversations I should know about? About the property?" He dried his hands on the towel and didn't look at me directly. "Serena mentioned once that her firm has a division that does estate transition planning. She thought it might be useful to talk to someone. You know, just to have everything organized." Organized for whom? The silence that followed was the most honest thing he'd said all evening. He was not malicious. I want to be clear about that. My son is not a malicious person. He was in love with someone skilled, and he had been slowly, gently, affectionately led toward a conversation he didn't fully understand he was having. I recognized it because I had watched it happen in slow motion and had hoped I was wrong, and now I wasn't wrong, and the sadness of it was not about the house. It was never really about the house. It was about watching someone use my son's love for me as a vehicle. I said, "Daniel, I need you to sit down." We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. I told him everything. The 3 conversations in the first year, Patricia's read on the situation, the steps I had taken with my estate. I was not accusatory. I laid it out factually, the way you lay out evidence to someone who you trust to evaluate it honestly. Partway through, I watched his face change from confusion to embarrassment to something that looked like grief. "She never asked me directly," he said. "It was always just she'd bring something up, and it would seem reasonable, and I'd think about it, and then somehow it had become an idea I thought I'd had on my own." "That's how it works," I said. "That's exactly how it works." He asked me what I wanted him to do. I told him that was his decision to make, and that I would support him through whatever it was, and that my concern was not about controlling his choices. My concern was that he walk into the rest of his life with his eyes open. If he loved Serena and believed she loved him honestly, I would find a way to accept that. What I could not accept was the alternative that she had spent 2 years carefully cultivating access to something that belonged to our family, without ever having the courage to be honest about what she wanted. Daniel ended the engagement 3 weeks later. He called me to tell me on a Sunday, in the middle of a snowfall, and his voice was quiet and tired and more like his father's voice than I had ever heard it. He said it hadn't been just the estate planning conversations. Once he'd started looking with clear eyes, he'd found other things, small deceptions, small redirections, small moments of calculation that he had previously translated into competence and confidence. Serena, it turned out, was a person who moved through relationships with a goal, and when the goal became visible, there was nothing left underneath it to love. He drove to Brockville the following Sunday. I made soup. We walked along the water in the cold, our breath visible in the November air, and he held my arm the way he used to when he was small, and we were walking somewhere unfamiliar. "I should have paid more attention," he said. "You paid exactly the attention that someone in love pays," I said. "That's not a failure. That's just being human." We stood at the edge of the property for a while, looking out at the river. The house was behind us, solid and unremarkable, and entirely ours. I had not saved anything dramatic. There had been no confrontation in a public place, no document dramatically produced, no moment of revenge that an audience could applaud. What I had done was quieter than that, and in some ways more satisfying. I had seen clearly, prepared carefully, and refused to let the fear of being wrong stop me from protecting what mattered. And what mattered was not the half-acre lot, not the century home with the original hardwood floors, not the property assessment or the deed in the Bank of Montreal lockbox. What mattered was the person standing beside me, finally looking at the same river I'd been looking at for years, finally seeing the same thing I saw. Some things are not about money, they never were. But sometimes it takes someone reaching for what you have to remind you, with absolute clarity, what you actually value. It's not the land, it's not the legacy. It's the people who would never think to reach for it in the first place. Those are the ones you hold on to. Those are the ones that were always worth protecting.